So welcome to APIsec University's the APIsec Con for banking. So my name is Dave Bisak. As Dan mentioned, I'm Chief API Officer at Aperture. I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. But I'm going to be basically talking about a practitioner's guide to designing and governing banking APIs, kind of experience report of what I've learned over the past few years of doing this work. So the first sentence here is just kind of the Aperture marketing stuff. But basically, Aperture provides online banking services for several hundred community banks and credit unions throughout the US. So if you saw Don Cardinal's presentation on FDX, Aperture would be a vehicle in which a financial institution could then implement an FDX API or provide conformance to Dodd-Frank 1033 without having to stand up their own APIs. We could provide all those API services for community banks. And so these APIs that we provide are primarily designed to support the financial institution, which is banks and credit unions, their banking web applications and their mobile applications. We build these mobile applications and deploy them into the app stores on behalf of these financial institutions, but also the administrative banking applications that the FIs and their partners run in the back office in order to manage their financial institution and their customers and their accounts and provide services to people. So as the name implies, Aperture, APIs are really key to what we do. It's literally in our name. And you'll probably notice throughout my presentation here that all of our standard, PowerPoint slide iconography and imagery is all kind of these little API hexagons and things like that. So we're kind of well versed in the API space, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So myself, I joined Aperture when the company was founded 7 years ago to create their API program. The goal was to create a set of APIs for digital banking to allow and foster innovation in the space. So I came on in 2017. I've been Chief API Officer, as Dan mentioned, since 2021. And in that role, I'm responsible for the design and architecture of all of our APIs, as well as our API governance program, how we manage our APIs, including API security. So how do we keep those APIs secure? And I'm responsible for developer experience, making sure that people can use our APIs in a secure way and succeed and build. So my team's mission is really to help our clients, which are these financial institutions, and our partners and their partners to succeed in creating innovative banking experiences using the APIs that we provide. There's some contact information for you down below, as well as being on LinkedIn. I don't participate on Twitter X anymore. I quit that a couple years ago, but you can find me on Mastodon. It's in fosstodon.org. And also I author a Substack called API Design Matters. So feel free to jump on there and take a look at the content. It's mostly things around using OpenAPI to design APIs and various elements around that. And there's some content in there about keeping APIs secure. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, I got a couple of things I'd like to really kind of convey. We're going to talk about what I call the big secret up first, but then there's a bunch of other topics, and we'll get to each one of these as we progress through. So I want to start with the big secret up front. I'm not going to make you wait while we go off for a commercial break and listen to our sponsors before I give the big reveal, or I'm not going to put it at the end of the presentation. But I do want to share with you this notion that banking API security is not really special. It's certainly what I'm very interested in, and it occupies a lot of my time. And I think banking APIs are really cool, and that's what I spend my time on. But I realize that in the grand scheme of things, really banking APIs aren't really special. And what I mean by this is that the best practices for API security apply to banking API security. And the best practices for banking API security should apply to your API security, no matter what you're doing. And if you go back to July, and APIsec ran an APIsec Con on the automotive industry, and there were automotive APIs, and security is just as crucial for automotive APIs as it is for banking APIs, et cetera. So everything that we do to secure Aperture's APIs can and should be applied to any API that manages any kind of sensitive customer data. And really, the point here is that strong API security practices will be an asset to your API program no matter what your domain. So the banking domain has certain things that are special about it, or really they're kind of different about it because we're dealing with people's money. And really what that means is that banking APIs are going to be an especially attractive target to malevolent actors, attackers. They're going to try to break into your accounts or get to your identity or get to your money through banking APIs. So we treat security very, very seriously because we do know that APIs are the emerging attack vector for bad actors in the space. But all that really means is we just have to ramp everything up to turn it up to 11 in order to succeed in keeping the APIs and our customer data secure and safe. So the next thing I really want to talk about is getting principled. And really what I'm talking about here is the first thing that I did at Aperture was to establish a set of API design principles. And these are just general high-level guidelines that we use to create a decision procedure. Whenever we have to make a decision around our APIs, we fall back on these principles to help us guide that decision-making process. So the number one security or number one principle is always going to be security. And what this means is this priority list, everything trumps everything below it. So if there's a decision between making the API easy to use versus keeping it secure, we're going to fall on that side of keeping the API secure. Excuse me. And we'll give up a little bit of ease of use, or we might give up a little bit of extensibility or consistency in order to keep it secure. So this is kind of what guides our decision procedure whenever we have an engineering decision to make. So as I mentioned, the higher priority items at the top of the list guide us in that decision-making process. And I really encourage organizations to add a little bit of rigor to their engineering discipline by having these types of decision procedures and guiding principles so that when you're forced to make some sort of decision, you fall on the side of security, but otherwise, if things are secure, then you just know how to proceed and make decisions and move forward. It's really good to have this type of stuff established between your API team and your engineering team and your architecture team and even your product team. They all have input into these decisions around what your company does and what you build. So let me give you a couple of examples of this. So when we started creating our current suite of APIs, one of the first things we did was create a clean segregation of APIs based on who's going to be using those APIs and for what purpose and which applications. So we segregated out customer-facing APIs, those that are used in your online banking application. Get a list and view your accounts and look at your account balances, and then go to an account, view your account details, view transactions against that account over the last 60 or 90 days or back in time. Those are customer-facing API. Excuse me. Those are customer-facing APIs that are connected to a customer and connected to that customer's accounts. And so they have different sets of authorization and entitlement access controls and security concerns compared to administrative applications that a back office application might use in order to do, say, fraud detection or something like that, or that the bank might use to do some report generation, et cetera. They have different audiences and therefore they have different authorizations. So our front-end applications can use OAuth 2 authorization code flow or OpenID Connect in order for the end user to securely authenticate and get an access token in order to invoke API operations securely with that customer's identity. And then that identity is used to grant them authorization to certain resources like accounts, et cetera. Versus for the admin applications, we might use client credentials to keep an application secure. And those client credentials are not associated with an individual user, so they have a different context and a different type of application that can use those. Now, that's an important distinction to make, the segregation of these APIs. It does reduce the ease of use and the developer experience. So we gave up a little bit of ease of use here, because when you have these two different sets of APIs, now, for example, within these API sets, there's 2 or 3 different ways to list accounts. The end user can list their accounts. They're only going to see their accounts. But an admin application might want to say, show them all the accounts that have been active this past 3 days, for example. And it's going to look across all different users and all different account types. So it's important to keep those distinctions, because it affects both the design of the APIs and the authorization and access controls. Excuse me. So another example is, we have basically a pretty hard rule for API security, in that we don't use any PII, like account numbers or social security numbers, in API URLs. They're not, this PII is not used as part of the URL path to access any particular resources, like a customer or a customer's account. Instead, we employ a more, slightly harder to use API pattern, which is like a get over post. That is, we use a post operation where you pass in the sensitive search criteria in the request body, rather than passing in on query parameters, because query parameters and request URLs often get logged in API access logs or web logs or other types of things. We don't want that sensitive information showing up in places that are not necessarily governed or controlled through your normal API security practices, et cetera. So it keeps this information secure so that hackers can't get to this type of information. All the APIs are done over TLS, so the requests are secure. So you can't just can't just spy on request bodies to get to this data. It does make some of these API operations a little bit harder to use, but again, that's that trade-off that we've got with these design principles, and that security always takes precedence. So the next tip is to kind of get schooled. So now you've got a set of principles. Now it's time to go to school. So as I said before, banking API security is not really special. It's not rocket science. It's not a trivial thing by any means, but it is a knowable endeavor. And there's lots of great resources out there to help you along the way. So APIsec University is certainly a superb resource, and the training that they provide and the workshops that Dan does, et cetera, are really, really great. So I was at the Nordic APIs conference back in March, and Dan presented kind of the overview or workshop for API security there. Really good content. So if you haven't participated in those, I highly encourage it. APIsec Con, so the conferences that they've been doing this year, I think this is the 3rd one. Great resource. So thank you all for attending. You're taking a really great step forward in educating yourself about API security. And I encourage you to participate. So if you've got something you want to share, I highly encourage people to share their knowledge and stuff. But there's other resources as well. So the OWASP API Security Top 10, if you're not familiar with those, excuse me, please take a look. I'm still kind of more familiar with the 2019 edition of the Security Top 10 versus the 2023, or at least those are the names of the security vulnerabilities that I tend to fall back on when I talk about API security vulnerabilities. So standard bullet attacks, so broken object level authorization attacks, et cetera. I tend to fall back on the 2019 security top 10, but there's the 2023 updates to that security. So take a look at those. But OWASP has lots of other resources as well. If you haven't taken a look at the completely ridiculous API, it just shows kind of a real world example of really poor practice for building an API that exhibits all of these different vulnerabilities, excessive data exposure, et cetera, like that. So it's a great learning opportunity to take a look at those. But also, the next step here is your best defense. And really, I think most people can finish the sentence, your best defense is a good offense. So take a very proactive stance around API security. adopt it as the central driver of your API governance program. If you're going to be creating APIs or publishing APIs, um, be very aggressive and assertive and proactive in addressing API security. But an important part here is to realize that API security is really a human-centric or a corporate culture initiative. It's not just about tools. You can't just buy some off-the-shelf tools or whatever and add it to your environment and think now you've got a secure program. You're not going to get API security from just a WAF or an API gateway or some other vendor tool. It's really more holistic to keep in mind what you need to do. Having just said that, though, I will talk a little bit about tools because I love tools and building tools and automating things as much as possible. So the goal here is to align your tools with your strategic goals. And your strategic goals go beyond just your API program or your API team. They go back to what is the product that your company is actually selling to others? What is your value proposition? And how are you enabling access to that company value through your APIs? And as you do that, as your company evolves and grows, if you're going through digital transformation or whatever it is, realize that tools can help and should align with those strategic goals of what you're trying to do, what your company is trying to do. And a really important aspect of this is to utilize tools to catch design flaws in your APIs as early as possible. And this is quite often done with static analysis tools. There are also dynamic analysis tools and pen testing and things like that. So you want to add all of these things to your tool chest and become proficient in them. So for example, we use an open source tool called Spectral. Originally, it was developed from the folks at Stoplight. Stoplight then got acquired by SmartBear. So they've been rolled into the SmartBear ecosystem and the Swagger hub tools and things like that. But Spectral is still an open source tool that you can just download and start using immediately. And it has a whole bunch of rules that are kind of built in for linting your open API. And there is a custom OWASP rule set that was coded to basically apply a lot of the OWASP 2019 API Security Top 10 rules into a codified rule set that Spectral can use to analyze your API. And we use this quite extensively in our tool chain. So it will warn you, for example, if your response schema defines an array, but you haven't put a constraint on that array to say what's the maximum number of items that can show up in that array. Or if you've got a string response property in your JSON, if you haven't declared the maximum length for that string, or say it's in a request body, if you haven't declared a max length for that string or a max items for an array, then that becomes a place where someone can try to abuse your API with a distributed DOS attack or try to overload your API with more data than you might be expecting, etc. So there's lots of rules within the OWASP tool set or rule set for Spectral. There are other tools that you can employ as well. So APIsec has some tools as well. The idea is you want to make those tools not optional. So integrate them into your tool chain and employ this shift left mentality. So we've integrated them into our IDE. So if you're using VS Code or other tools to build your open API definition to define what your API is, you can run these tools inside the IDE so you can catch these vulnerabilities and exposures as soon as possible in the design phase of the API. But also, we integrated into pre-push hooks. We use Git for source code control. All of our APIs are defined in source with Open API, and the repositories that contain those use pre-push hooks to enforce all these rules. So we enforce the linting and we enforce that you don't have any of these vulnerabilities or violations of the Spectral and the OWASP rule sets. Integrate this into your CI/CD process. So when your process is doing any type of continuous integration, builds, etc., apply the tools there as well. Fail the build if there are any of these violations, if you have any of these errors that are caught by these tools. fail to build so that nothing gets past that stage. You can't deploy anything that has any of these violations in it. So being strict about that is really important. And then also employ kind of security infrastructure as code. So we also, since we use Spectral and the OWASP tool set, Spectral is an extensible tool. You can write your own rules, put those tools and rules into source code, and then apply standard peer review, GitHub or whatever Git repository you're using, use pull request and team reviews of any changes to any of that security infrastructure. And that could also be configuration for other security tools that you might be employing, configuration for your WAF or for your API gateway, et cetera, should all be managed as source code, sort of infrastructure as code policies there. So make sure that the people who are responsible for that are aware of API security and are applying the best practices with peer review. Second is to, again, align those tools with strategic goals. So that basically means, and tools is a very broad term here, but try to always use robust and tested software. And the second bullet item is really what's very critical here is don't create your own security libraries, especially around auth. Use well-tested, robust, hardened libraries and other software for those types of things. Find a trusted partner and then work with them. Also use a robust entitlement engine, and that's kind of down at the lower level of the system. When you're implementing these APIs, you want to make sure that the APIs are using an entitlements engine in order to verify that the caller of the API actually has authorization to access a particular resource, to either read or to update or delete that particular resource. And a good entitlement engine can keep track of that. So this is information, this is stuff that needs to be pushed down, not just in the API controller tier, but it has to be down in the business logic tier as well, so that if you are accessing these services through some other mechanism, through another library instead of going through the API, those entitlement checks are still enforced. And then be aware that anyone can run these tools. So if you've got API definitions, you've got a developer portal, someone can download those open API definitions from your developer portal or get them from some other source, and then they can run the Spectral tool against that. What you don't want is to have your adversaries, hackers, or you don't want the community or even your clients uncovering a vulnerability by running these tools against your API definitions, saying, hey, are you aware that you've got a potential vulnerability in your API? It's shown right here by this Spectral tool. You don't want that experience. So the more you apply these tools and prevent any kind of vulnerability from leaking into your design, the better you're going to be. Next item up is setting expectations. And I mentioned this earlier a little bit about API security is not just a technology problem and solution. It's really a people problem and solution. So you want to shift API security left as much as possible, but it means left to other teams outside of just your engineering team or your API team, but you want to shift it left to your operations team so that they're aware of API security. They're the people that are responsible for monitoring your APIs and deploying them, but also shift it to your product team, the team that is defining what your product actually does, making sure they're aware of API security and how important it is to keep your API secure. And there's already been presentations at this conference that they've kind of talked about, you know, the standard vulnerabilities that people see in APIs. You don't want those things happening to your company. So shifting it left to your executive team is really treating API security as an investment in your company, as an investment into your value proposition as to what it is your product does, and keeping it secure is really safeguarding that investment. So it's like buying an insurance policy. And I'll say it again, as I said earlier, strong API security practices will always be an asset to your API program. So really what I'm getting at here is aligning your API security with strategic goals for your company with all organizations within your company. So socialize and evangelize security and teach API security. And I've got a little quote at the bottom there says, if you want to master something, explain it. So we have a peer learning program at Aperture called Aperture University, in which people can present topics that are of interest to them or to share with other people. And that's a great way to evangelize or teach API security. So we've had sessions on the OWASP API Security Top 10 and various other aspects of API design and API security. But socialize it with your quality team, whoever does quality assurance, whether it's your engineering team or you have a separate quality assurance or quality engineering team. They're the ones who can be empowered to test API security by running pen tests and other types of API security testing. Your ops team, again, they should be responsible for monitoring not just the health of your APIs and whether they're up and running, et cetera, but also are they secure? And so working with other vendors, you can have some runtime dynamic analysis security tools to monitor your API security. But the goal here is to foster an API security mindset and set this corporate level expectation, and that API security is everyone's responsibility. So if you don't do it, no one else will, is really what I'm trying to get to. So it's something you can kind of take on as an extra responsibility. And then before I wrap up, or as I wrap up, I guess the last topic here is kind of phone a friend. And basically, I'm trying to say, don't go it alone. So lean on partners. So in API banking, for example, we can lean on partners to help us comply with banking regulations. So within banking, a customer identity program, or a CIP, is, or also known as a know your customer, is a required element in US banking regulations in order to prevent fraud, so that you don't have bad actors coming in and opening up accounts in order to do money laundering or to pay for terrorist activity or whatever it is you want to do. So knowing your customer is important to prevent malicious use of your banking experience. But you don't want to build a customer identity program on your own. You want to work with a partner who already does this and does it really well. So don't roll your own. And the same is true for safely linking external accounts and verifying that someone has knowledge and ownership of an external account before they can link it in order to do transfers either in or out of that external account from your current bank. So all these things are things you want to use partners instead of trying to build it yourself. Another example of this is using a strong identity provider infrastructure for your APIs. So users can log in using an identity provider. They can use it to change their password, change their profile information, et cetera, and let the identity provider do what it does best, and don't replicate or build that type of stuff yourself. And that then applies to things like two-factor or multi-factor authentication for logging in, or runtime operation level identity challenges, for example, to verify the identity of someone before they do certain key banking operations, such as scheduling a transfer to or from an external financial institution, or ordering debit cards, et cetera. You can verify the customer's identity through identity challenges, and that can be built into the APIs as well, such that they have to successfully complete an identity challenge and you provide a unique, valid and current identity challenge response in an API request before you can proceed with that particular operation. And then finally, the biggest mission that I want to get across is don't blaze a trail alone. The API community is really here to help. And I said before that good API security is not rocket science. It is a known entity. There are a lot of people who know quite a bit and are really, really willing to share what they know. So, APIsec, you, et cetera, but folks like Corey Ball, Adam, who's one of the opening keynote speakers, Keith Danger, Casey, follow these folks and see what they're talking about and stay informed. And as I mentioned earlier, forge vendor partnerships, work with those partners to fill in the gaps and don't try to build everything yourself. You can't boil the ocean. But know your adversary as well. So Dana Epp has a really good newsletter on hacking APIs and API security, and how to attack APIs. So read those so you understand how people are going to be attacking your APIs. and then you can defend against them. If you don't know what's going on, you can't defend.